Picture this: you're sick with a fever, and instead of reaching for medicine, your doctor pulls out a star chart to see if the planets are out of alignment. Or maybe they prescribe a potion made from crushed gemstones, insisting it'll balance the mysterious fluids swirling inside you. Sounds like something from a fantasy novel, right? But for people living in the Middle Ages, this wasn't fiction, it was cutting-edge medicine. The medieval world was a place where science and superstition collided in the most extraordinary ways, where the human body was seen as a battleground of cosmic forces, mystical energies, and downright bizarre theories. And today, we're diving headfirst into that strange and fascinating realm. Think about how far modern medicine has come: vaccines, antibiotics, surgeries performed with pinpoint precision. Now imagine the opposite, a time when doctors believed illnesses were caused by imbalances in bodily fluids called humors, or that a sneeze could expel evil spirits from your soul. Medieval healers relied on everything from astrology to animal parts, blending ancient wisdom with wild creativity. Some of their cures were poetic, like using roses to soothe the heart. Others were downright terrifying, like swallowing molten gold to cure the plague. And the craziest part, people swore by these treatments, passing them down for centuries as life-saving knowledge. So why does any of this matter? Because these beliefs weren't just quirks of history. They shaped how people lived, suffered, and survived. They reveal a world where the line between science and magic was blurry at best, where desperation and ingenuity went hand in hand. By exploring these 25 bizarre medieval beliefs, we're not just laughing at the past, we're uncovering the roots of modern medicine, tracing how far we've come, and maybe even spotting a few echoes of these old ideas in today's wellness trends. Ready to step into a world where leeches were lifesavers and a unicorn's horn could purify poison? Let's begin. If you walked into a medieval doctor's chamber complaining of a headache or fatigue, chances are they wouldn't ask about your symptoms, they'd ask about your personality. That's because health wasn't just about the body back then. It was about the balance of 4 mysterious fluids known as humors. Blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile weren't just bodily substances. They were cosmic forces believed to dictate everything from your mood to your fate. Too much blood, you'd be labeled sanguine, cheerful but impulsive, and in dire need of a good bleeding. Excess phlegm, that explained sluggishness, and the cure might involve vomiting herbs to purge the sluggishness away. This wasn't just some fringe theory. The 4 humors doctrine came straight from the ancient Greeks, championed by Hippocrates and later Galen, and medieval healers clung to it like gospel. Think about that. For over 1,000 years, if you had a fever, the solution wasn't to rest or hydrate. It was to drain your blood until you fainted, all in the name of balancing these invisible fluids. And the wildest part, it wasn't just physical ailments tied to humors. Your entire temperament was at stake. Black bile made you melancholic, prone to sadness and overthinking. Yellow bile, that meant a choleric temper, quick to anger. Even today, we unknowingly echo these ideas when we call someone good-humored or bilious. The treatments were just as extreme as the diagnoses. Bloodletting wasn't a rare last resort. It was as routine as taking aspirin. Barbers doubled as surgeons, using razors to open veins or applying leeches to suck out excess blood. If you were suffering from too much phlegm, you might be given a potion to induce violent vomiting. And if bile was the culprit, prepare for a diet of bitter herbs and laxatives. The logic was brutal but consistent. Purge the imbalance, no matter the cost. What's truly astonishing is how long this belief held sway. Even as autopsies began to reveal the actual workings of organs, even as plagues swept through cities proving these cures useless, the humor's theory persisted. It took until the Renaissance for scholars to finally question it, but by then, generations had suffered through agonizing, ineffective treatments. Yet, in a strange way, this flawed system laid the groundwork for modern medicine. The idea that the body could be out of balance evolved into our understanding of homeostasis. Those early, misguided attempts to categorize illnesses paved the way for real diagnostic science. So while we might scoff at medieval doctors for their leeches and potions, they were, in their own way, trying to make sense of the chaos, one bizarre treatment at a time. Ever notice how a walnut looks uncannily like a tiny human brain? To medieval healers, that wasn't just a coincidence, it was a divine sign. Welcome to the Doctrine of Signatures, one of the most poetic yet perplexing medical beliefs of the Middle Ages. The idea was simple. God had hidden clues in nature, designing plants to resemble the very body parts they could heal. Need to treat a headache? Crack open a walnut, its wrinkled surface mirroring the folds of your brain. Suffering from a cough? Seek out lungwort, its spotted leaves eerily similar to diseased lungs. On the surface, it almost makes sense until you realize medieval medicine was essentially playing a cosmic game of charades. This wasn't just folk superstition, it was a philosophy steeped in religious awe. Scholars like Paracelsus argued that the natural world was a coded message from the Creator, and it was humanity's job to decipher it. Yellow flowers like celandine were used to treat jaundice, their golden hue supposedly drawing out the yellow illness. Kidney beans, naturally, they were prescribed for kidney ailments. Even mandrake roots, twisted into human-like shapes, were believed to shriek when uprooted and could cure anything from infertility to insomnia, if you dared to harvest them without going deaf from their mythical screams. But here's the twist, sometimes it almost worked. Modern science has found that lungwort does contain compounds with mild anti-inflammatory properties, and walnuts are packed with omega-3s, which do support brain health. Of course, medieval healers had no idea why these remedies might have an effect. They were too busy interpreting God's botanical hieroglyphics. And for every accidental success, there were dozens of absurd failures. Eyebright, a flower thought to resemble eyes, was used for vision problems despite having no real impact on eyesight. Heart-shaped plants like vervain were chewed to ward off heart disease, even as people dropped dead from undiagnosed conditions. What's truly remarkable is how long this belief persisted. Well into the Renaissance, apothecaries stocked their shelves with signature-based cures, and the idea still lingers in some herbal traditions today. It's a testament to humanity's desire to find patterns, to believe the universe is whispering answers if we just know how to listen. In a world without microscopes or clinical trials, the Doctrine of Signatures offered a comforting logic, a way to make sense of suffering through symbolism. And while we might chuckle at the notion of eating foxglove for heart health, its blossoms do look like glove-worthy fingers. We're not so different today. How often do we gravitate toward natural remedies because they feel right, even without hard evidence? The medieval mind might have taken it to extremes, but the impulse to seek harmony between nature and the body is still alive and well. Here's a medical practice so bizarre it sounds like it was ripped straight from a fantasy novel. Imagine getting stabbed in battle, and instead of bandaging your wound, the doctor carefully applies a special ointment to the sword that cut you. Welcome to the world of weapon salve, one of medieval medicine's most mind-bending beliefs. This wasn't some backwoods superstition. It was a legit treatment endorsed by big-name physicians like Paracelsus, who swore that healing a wound remotely by treating the weapon that caused it was not just possible, but scientifically sound. The logic behind weapon salve was rooted in the idea of sympathetic magic, the belief that objects once connected remained mystically linked. Just like voodoo dolls or love charms, the weapon and the wound were thought to share an invisible bond. So if you smeared a concoction of herbs, animal fat, and sometimes even human blood on the blade, the injury itself would miraculously heal. Some recipes even called for moss grown on a human skull to boost the salve's potency. It wasn't enough to just clean and dress the wound, oh no. The real power lay in anointing the weapon, as if medicine could travel backward through time and space to undo the damage. What's wild is that this wasn't just a fringe theory. Paracelsus, a towering figure in Renaissance medicine, argued that weapon salve worked because of magnetic forces long before scientists understood magnetism at all. He claimed the salve drew the injury's essence out through the weapon like pulling poison from a snake bite, and people bought it. Knights, soldiers, and even royalty submitted to this counterintuitive remedy, convinced it was cutting-edge science. Never mind that infections raged untreated while doctors lovingly polished blood-stained daggers. But here's the kicker, sometimes it seemed to work. Why? Because weapon salve recipes often included antiseptic ingredients like turpentine or copper salts. So while the doctor was busy rubbing ointment on a sword, the actual wound might have been exposed to clean bandages or residual salve, enough to prevent infection by sheer accident. Of course, that didn't stop practitioners from crediting the magic instead of the microbes they couldn't even see. This belief clung on stubbornly, even as early skeptics like Sir Kenelm Digby mocked it as quackery dressed in scholars' robes. But weapon salve's legacy is more than just a historical oddity. It's a cautionary tale about how easily we confuse correlation with causation. How many modern wellness trends, from crystal healing to energy bracelets, operate on the same shaky logic? We might laugh at medieval doctors for their sword-rubbing rituals, but the urge to believe in invisible connections between objects, between causes and effects, is as human as ever. And that's the real wound that never quite heals. In an era where doctors couldn't explain fevers or stop plagues, people turned to higher powers literally. Imagine trekking for miles on blistered feet, clutching a sick child, just to press your forehead against a glass case holding a saint's finger bone. For medieval believers, relics weren't macabre curiosities, they were lifelines. The idea that a sliver of a martyr's rib or a thread from the Virgin Mary's robe could cure blindness or banish tumors wasn't just hopeful thinking, it was state-of-the-art medicine. Saints became specialists, Anthony for ergot poisoning, Apollonia for toothaches, and Catherine for midwives struggling through difficult births. This wasn't blind faith, it was a system as elaborate as any modern medical directory, complete with heavenly doctors on call. The scale of these pilgrimages would put today's wellness retreats to shame. Take Mont Saint Michel, where thousands flocked to touch the Archangel's relics, or Canterbury, where Thomas Becket's blood was diluted into vials and sold as spiritual antibiotics. The sick would sleep in relic-filled churches, convinced holiness seeped into them overnight like medicine. And sometimes it seemed to work. Plague victims who prayed to Saint Roch occasionally recovered, not because of divine intervention, but because quarantine practices near his shrines reduced infection rates. Saint Blaise's feast day involved blessing throats with crossed candles, a ritual that may have unknowingly soothed inflammation through the placebo effect or even the candle's beeswax fumes. But relics weren't just about healing, they were medieval healthcare with a side of showmanship. Churches competed to display the most extravagant relics, like Charlemagne's embalmed corpse sitting upright on a throne or Saint Denis carrying his own severed head. The faithful didn't just want miracles, they wanted drama, a tangible connection to the divine that made their suffering feel part of a grander story. And when science failed, when leeches and lancets only made things worse, these beliefs offered something rare: comfort. In a world where half of children died before age 5, where plagues erased entire villages, relics gave people agency. Praying to Saint Margaret during childbirth wasn't just superstition. It was a way to shout into the void and believe someone was listening. What's fascinating is how these practices blurred the line between pharmacy and faith. Monks distilled relic-infused water as holy tonics, and amulets containing parchment scraps of saintly prayers were worn like medical alert bracelets. Even skeptics participated, because when your child's fever wouldn't break, why not hedge your bets? Today, we see echoes of this in placebo studies, or the way patients with terminal illnesses clutch lucky charms. The relics may have changed now, it's crystal necklaces or healing magnets, but the human longing for control over chaos remains the same. Medieval believers weren't naive, they were resourceful, using every tool they had, earthly or otherwise, to fight the terrifying unknown. And in that struggle, sometimes hope itself was the most potent relic of all. The moon wasn't just a celestial body to medieval healers, it was a silent puppeteer, tugging at the strings of human health with every phase. Picture a surgeon refusing to operate because the moon was waxing, or a physician warning that a full moon could turn a mild fever into a raging madness. This wasn't superstition, it was science as they understood it. The very word lunacy comes from luna, the Latin word for moon, because people genuinely believed its light could tip the scales of sanity. And it wasn't just mental health at stake. From arthritis flare-ups to childbirth complications, the moon was blamed or credited for shifts in the body's invisible tides. The logic behind this belief traced back to ancient observations. Just as the moon pulled ocean waves, medieval thinkers argued it must also tug at the fluid-filled human body. Blood, phlegm, even the mysterious vital spirits were thought to surge and recede like an internal sea. Surgeons took this deadly seriously. The 14th century surgeon Guy de Chauliac wrote detailed manuals instructing colleagues to avoid bloodletting during full moons when bodily fluids were overstimulated. Even childbirth was timed around lunar cycles, with midwives urging mothers to wait for a waning moon, believing it would ease delivery by drawing fluids downward. But the moon's influence didn't stop at physical health. Mental hospitals, or bedlams, reported spikes in erratic behavior during full moons, reinforcing the lunacy myth. Epileptic seizures were dubbed moonfall sickness, and sleepwalkers were said to be moonstruck. Some healers prescribed lunar-charged talismans, silver amulets engraved during specific moon phases, to ward off seizures or melancholy. Others brewed moon water, leaving basins outdoors to absorb the orb's ethereal energy, then using it to wash wounds or calm hysterical patients. What's fascinating is how much of this echoed real phenomena, just misinterpreted. Modern studies have linked lunar cycles to slight changes in sleep patterns, possibly due to ancient evolutionary responses to moonlight. And while the moon doesn't cause madness, its brightness could disrupt sleep, exacerbating conditions like bipolar disorder. Medieval observers weren't entirely wrong to notice patterns. They just lacked the tools to separate correlation from causation. This cosmic connection persisted well into the Enlightenment. Almanacs printed moon phase health advisories alongside weather forecasts, and farmers still planted crops by lunar calendars. Today, we've swapped moon water for melatonin and lunar talismans for light therapy lamps, but the instinct remains. We still crave rhythms, still scan the night sky for answers. The moon may not control our bodies, but it certainly captivated our minds. proving that even the wildest medieval beliefs often sprang from a very human desire to find order in the chaos of existence. Deep in the stomachs of goats and llamas, hidden like buried treasure, medieval healers believed they'd found nature's ultimate defense against death itself, the Bezor stone. These lumpy, hardened masses, formed from layers of undigested hair or plant fibers, weren't just curiosities. They were hailed as the ultimate antidote, capable of neutralizing any poison from snake venom to arsenic. Picture a king raising a jewel-encrusted goblet at a feast, his Bezor dangling inside like a secret guardian, or a noblewoman clutching hers like a talisman as political rivals eyed her wine. In a world where poisoning was the ultimate silent assassin, these strange stones became the ultimate status symbol, part medicine, part medieval insurance policy. The craze for Bezors wasn't just blind faith, it was fueled by a mix of observation and desperation. When an animal survived eating toxic plants, people assumed the stone in its gut had absorbed the poison. Never mind that the real reason was likely the animal's robust digestion or sheer luck. The legend stuck. By the 16th century, European apothecaries sold Bezors for sums that could buy a small estate, and their powers were put to horrifying tests. In one infamous trial, a Portuguese physician force-fed a condemned prisoner mercury, then shoved a Bezor into his mouth. When the man died anyway, the doctor's conclusion wasn't that the stone was useless, it was that the prisoner must have gotten a fake Bezor. What's chilling is how far people went to secure these magic stones. Persian traders smuggled them from mountain goats, while European explorers looted llamas in the Andes. The wealthiest collectors even had theirs mounted in gold filigree, worn as pendants or ground into powder for emergency tonics. And the placebo effect was strong. Some poison victims did recover after Bezor treatments, likely because the dose wasn't lethal to begin with. But the stone's real power lay in psychology. Holding one gave people the illusion of control in an era where a single meal could be a death sentence. Modern science has since debunked Bezors as antidotes, though they're still studied as medical oddities. Surgeons occasionally find them in human patients, and some traditional medicines still use them despite zero evidence they work. But their legacy lingers in our language. Bezor comes from the Persian word for antidote, a reminder of how deeply we once believed in these lumpy talismans. Today, we might scoff at the idea of swallowing a hairball to cure poisoning, but the instinct hasn't vanished. How many of us pop vitamin gummies or chug charcoal smoothies, chasing the same promise of purity, the same desperate hope that somewhere, in a pill, a stone, a ritual, there's a shield against the toxins of the world? The Bezor story isn't just about medieval quackery. It's about the timeless human dance between fear and the desperate search for a cure. In the desperate search for cures, medieval medicine reached a point where the line between healer and grave robber blurred beyond recognition. Imagine a pharmacy where the shelves weren't stocked with herbs or potions but with powdered mummies, vials of blood from executed criminals, and jars of moss scraped from skulls. This was the grim reality of corpse medicine, a practice that turned human remains into coveted remedies. From royalty to peasants, people swallowed concoctions made from the dead, convinced that the essence of life could be stolen back from the departed. King Charles II of England famously carried a flask of King's Drops, a tincture distilled from crushed human skulls, believing it could ward off seizures and restore vitality. The logic behind corpse medicine was as chilling as it was convoluted. Ancient Egyptians preserved bodies to honor the dead, but medieval Europeans ground them up to heal the living. Mummies stolen from tombs and smuggled across continents were prized for their life force, thought to linger in their preserved flesh. apothecaries sold mumia, a powder made from mummified remains, as a cure-all for everything from bruises to the plague. Even blood held mystical power. Public executions became macabre pharmacies, with spectators paying to sip the still warm blood of the condemned, convinced it could cure epilepsy or grant strength. But why, in a world without antibiotics or understanding of disease, the idea of cures took grotesque turns? If a skull housed the mind, surely consuming it could mend madness. If blood carried vitality, drinking it might replenish a wasting body. The desperation was palpable. When plagues swept through cities, leaving corpses piled in streets, some saw not tragedy but opportunity, harvesting fat from the dead to make salves, or boiling bones into bone broth believed to restore health. The most haunting part, this wasn't some dark age superstition. Well into the 18th century, respected physicians prescribed corpse remedies. The Irish philosopher Francis Bacon wrote that fresh human blood could treat falling sickness, while the famous surgeon Ambroise Paré recommended mummy powder for internal bleeding. Even as science advanced, the demand for mumia grew so high that merchants faked it using the bodies of beggars or criminals, dried and dyed to look ancient. Today, the idea of consuming human remains for health seems unthinkable, but corpse medicine's legacy lingers in surprising ways. Modern transfusions and organ transplants echo that same hunger to borrow life from others, just sanitized by science. And let's not forget the placebo effect. How many of history's miracle cures worked simply because people believed they would? The real horror isn't just what medieval patients swallowed. It's how far fear can push us when death looms close and hope wears a gruesome disguise. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval village, a child's sudden fever wasn't just bad luck, it was a hex. A neighbor's lingering glance, a stranger's muttered words, even the shadow of a cat crossing the road could be enough to summon the dreaded evil eye, a curse believed to sicken livestock, wither crops, and strike people down with mysterious ailments. This wasn't just folklore, it was a medical diagnosis. When doctors couldn't explain why a healthy person wasted away or a cow's milk turned sour, the answer was clear. Someone had channeled malice through their gaze, and the only cure was counter-magic. The fear of the evil eye wasn't some niche superstition. It spanned continents and cultures. Italian mothers pinned red coral horns to their babies' clothing, while Turkish villagers hung Nazar amulets, those iconic blue glass eyes, above doorways. In Scotland, iron nails were driven into door frames to deflect envy's poison. These weren't decorations, they were medieval antivirals, a desperate armor against invisible harm. And if prevention failed, the treatments were just as elaborate. Healers might spit 3 times to break the curse's hold, or rub the victim with an egg before cracking it into water to reveal the hex's shape. Some prescribed drinking potions laced with silver filings, thought to purify the body from supernatural corruption, but the evil eye was just the beginning. When plagues erased entire towns or harvests failed, the blame often landed on an even darker force, witches. Medieval Europe's witch trials weren't just about punishment, they were twisted attempts at public health. If a midwife's patient died in childbirth, she might be accused of demonic sabotage. A reclusive woman who muttered to herself, clearly, she'd summoned the storm that spoiled the grain. The logic was circular and lethal. Sickness proved witchcraft, and witchcraft explained sickness. In Switzerland, outbreaks of ergot poisoning, a fungal infection causing hallucinations, sparked panics that sent hundreds to the stake, their deaths framed as a grim necessity to cleanse the community of disease. What's haunting is how these beliefs mirrored real medical ignorance. Without germ theory, people grasped for explanations that made emotional sense. If a curse could strike like lightning, then amulets and exorcisms were the only shields. When a witch's muttered words coincided with a neighbor's fever, confirmation bias did the rest. And sometimes the cures seemed to work, not because of magic, but because the ritual soothed panic. A child given a honey-laced antidote for the evil eye might recover simply because their immune system fought off the illness, but the story that stuck was the one about the hex being broken. This superstition's legacy is darker than most. While other medieval beliefs faded into curiosity, the fear of witchcraft fueled centuries of violence, its shadow stretching into the Salem trials and beyond. Yet even today, we see echoes of this thinking. How often do we attribute random misfortune to bad vibes or blame illnesses on unseen toxins? The evil eye reminds us that medicine isn't just about biology, it's about the stories we tell to make suffering bearable. And sometimes those stories can be as dangerous as the diseases they pretend to explain. Few plants in medieval lore were as feared or as coveted as the Mandrake root. With its twisted, human-like shape and reputation for unleashing a fatal scream when uprooted, this wasn't just a herb, it was a living talisman, pulsing with supernatural power. Ancient texts described its roots as miniature people, complete with limbs and even faces, leading to wild theories that it grew beneath gallows, sprouting from the dripping blood of executed criminals. If that wasn't eerie enough, harvesting one required a ritual straight out of a horror story. You couldn't just yank it from the earth like a carrot. Oh no. To avoid the root's deadly shriek, which could kill anyone within earshot, diggers were instructed to plug their ears with wax, tie a starving dog to the plant, then toss meat just out of reach. As the dog lunged, it would tear the mandrake free and supposedly absorb the fatal scream instead of its master. The mandrake's uses were as varied as they were bizarre. Women carried small pieces in their aprons to boost fertility, while soldiers tucked shreds into their armor for protection in battle. Sleepless nobles paid exorbitant sums for mandrake-infused wine, believing it could lull them into dreamless slumber. Some healers even fashioned the roots into dolls, dressing them in tiny clothes and feeding them milk or honey to amplify their magic. But the most chilling application. Criminals were said to slip mandrake extract into drinks as a potent knockout drug, an early form of date rape concoction nicknamed the Devil's Apple. What's fascinating isn't just the myth itself, but why it persisted so stubbornly. Mandrake does contain scopolamine and atropine compounds that, in precise doses, can induce drowsiness or hallucinations. Overuse, though, leads to paralysis or death, which likely fueled stories of its lethal scream. And that human-like shape, it's a classic example of pareidolia, our brain's tendency to see faces in random patterns. To medieval eyes, this resemblance wasn't coincidence. It was proof the plant bridged the gap between vegetable and human, making it the ultimate sympathetic magic tool. The mandrake's legacy slithers into modern times in unsettling ways. J.K. Rowling borrowed its scream for Harry Potter, and its silhouette still haunts occult shops today. But beyond the folklore, it's a stark reminder of how desperation bends belief. When medicine failed, when pain had no name, people clung to the mandrake's promise, even if it meant risking their lives to harvest it. In the end, the real magic wasn't in the root's shape or its scream, but in its power to make the hopeless feel, for a moment, like they had control over the uncontrollable. Imagine lying feverish in a medieval monastery, and instead of bitter potions, a monk begins to play a gentle melody on a harp, not to entertain you, but to cure you. This wasn't just soothing background noise. It was precision medicine, as carefully prescribed as any herb or lancet. Medieval healers believed music didn't just lift the spirit, it could realign the body's rhythms, mending everything from depression to digestive disorders. The idea traces back to Pythagoras, who claimed certain harmonies mirrored the mathematical perfection of the cosmos, and by the Middle Ages, monasteries had turned this into a full-blown therapy. Monks composed specific chants for specific ailments, slow, resonant tones to calm a racing heart, brisk melodies to stimulate sluggish digestion, and soaring harmonies to elevate black bile from melancholic patients. What's striking is how personalized these treatments were. Physicians would first diagnose a patient's dominant humor, blood, phlegm, bile, then prescribe music to counteract its excess. A sanguine person prone to excitability might get a serene, repetitive chant to ground them. Someone suffering from phlegmatic lethargy, a lively, rhythmic tune to wake up their system. Even the instruments mattered. Harps were thought to purify the blood, while deep-throated drums could shake loose congestion in the lungs. This wasn't just folk wisdom. The 9th century scholar Al-Kindi wrote entire treatises on how musical modes affected pulse rates, linking each note to organs and emotions in a proto-version of music therapy. The most fascinating part, modern science suggests they weren't entirely wrong. Studies show music does affect heart rate and stress hormones, and hospitals now use it to manage pain and anxiety. But medieval healers took it further, believing a well-tuned lyre could cure the plague or that chanting the right sequence of psalms might knit broken bones. Some monasteries kept musical infirmaries where patients lay in acoustically designed chambers, bathed in vibrations meant to restore their bodies' natural resonance. When the Black Death ravaged Europe, desperate crowds flocked to hear choirs perform the Missa pro defunctis, convinced its solemn tones could ward off the disease. Unlike bloodletting or corpse medicine, music therapy left no physical scars, just a legacy that feels oddly prescient. Today, we stream binaural beats to focus or play white noise to sleep, chasing the same idea: that sound can rewire us. The monks may have framed it in terms of humors and heavenly harmony, but their core insight that health isn't just about the body, but the invisible frequencies humming through it, was centuries ahead of its time. In an era so often defined by brutality, this belief stands out as a rare whisper of grace, the notion that healing could be beautiful. If you think modern hygiene debates are intense, medieval Europe would have sent you into a panic. While the Romans had built vast public baths centuries earlier, by the Middle Ages, washing your whole body was considered downright dangerous. Physicians warned that bathing, especially in warm water, could weaken the body by opening pores, allowing disease to creep in like thieves through an unbarred window. Forget scrubbing daily. Some believed washing just once a year was more than enough. King Louis XIV of France famously boasted about only bathing twice in his entire life, and even those occasions were under protest. The fear wasn't just about personal cleanliness. Public bathhouses, once bustling social hubs, became scapegoats for epidemics. When the Black Death ravaged Europe, many towns banned them outright, convinced the steamy air and shared water were spreading death itself. Never mind that the real culprit was fleas on rats. People watched neighbors fall ill after visiting baths and connected the dots all wrong. Some cities went further, claiming baths were dens of sin where immoral behavior, not miasmas, invited divine punishment in the form of plague. The irony: closing bathhouses may have worsened the spread of disease as people crowded into even filthier living conditions. But the anti-bathing craze wasn't universal. Islamic scholars of the same era wrote detailed treatises on the health benefits of regular washing, and Byzantine doctors prescribed baths for everything from arthritis to melancholy. Even in Europe, the wealthy sometimes indulged in scented, dry baths, rubbing themselves with linen cloths soaked in rose water or vinegar to avoid water's dangers. Perfume became a booming industry not just for vanity, but as a medicinal mask for the inevitable stench of unwashed bodies. What's truly bizarre is how this belief flipped earlier wisdom. Ancient Greeks and Romans saw bathing as essential to health, and Hippocrates himself recommended hydrotherapy. But as medieval scholars misinterpreted his work, they latched onto the idea that water could disrupt the body's delicate balance. A 15th century medical text even claimed bathing could cause fumes to rise to the brain, bringing on madness. The wealthy took this to extremes, wearing silk undergarments to wick away impurities instead of washing, while peasants relied on quick rinses of hands and face, if anything at all. The legacy of this fear lingers in unexpected ways. Modern epidemiologists note that some disease-carrying microbes do thrive in warm, wet environments. Medieval people weren't entirely wrong, just wildly misinformed. And let's be honest, how many of us still believe going outside with wet hair will cause a cold? The real lesson here isn't just about soap and water. It's about how easily fear can distort science, turning a basic act of self-care into a suspected death sentence. Centuries later, we're still learning to separate hygiene myths from facts, one shower at a time. If a medieval woman complained of dizziness, shortness of breath, or even just a bad mood, physicians would nod gravely and diagnose the culprit. Her uterus had gone rogue. This was the era of the wandering womb, a belief that the uterus wasn't firmly anchored but could slither through the body like a restless animal, pressing against organs and causing chaos. The concept originated with ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates, who described the womb as an independent creature inside a creature, capable of migrating upward to squeeze the lungs or downward to trigger bladder issues. By the Middle Ages, this idea had hardened into medical dogma with catastrophic consequences for women's health. The supposed symptoms of a wandering womb read like a catalogue of every ailment imaginable. Anxiety, clearly, the uterus had risen to crowd the heart. Fainting spells, it must be crushing the diaphragm. Even a woman's laughter or assertiveness could be blamed on her unruly organ, giving rise to the term hysteria, from the Greek hystera, meaning womb. Treatments ranged from bizarre to brutal. Physicians would place sweet-smelling herbs like lavender or rose near the vagina to lure the womb back into place, while foul odors like burnt hair or sulfur were held under the nose to repel it downward. Some manuals recommended binding the patient's ankles and shaking her violently to physically jostle the uterus into submission. What's chilling is how this theory weaponized ignorance. Male physicians, who rarely examined female patients directly, spun elaborate theories about a body part they'd never seen. The vaginal speculum existed in Roman times but was largely abandoned in medieval Europe as immodest, leaving doctors to diagnose based on speculation. And since the wandering womb could allegedly cause everything from insomnia to seizures, it became a catch-all explanation that sidelined real medical research. Women suffering from epilepsy, heart disease, or even simple stress were funneled into the same degrading treatments, their pain dismissed as hysterical theatrics. The legacy of this belief lingers in unsettling ways. The Victorian era's hysterical paroxysms and the brutal practice of female genital mutilation both stem from the same root, the idea that women's bodies are inherently unstable, needing external control. Even today, studies show women's pain is more likely to be downplayed by doctors, a bias with roots in those medieval diagnoses. The wandering womb theory wasn't just bad science, it was a license to ignore half the population's suffering, all because of a phantom organ gallivanting where it shouldn't. And the sweetest irony, modern anatomy reveals the uterus is held in place by ligaments so strong, it would take a seismic force to dislodge them, that restless, mischievous womb. It was never wandering at all. If you thought medieval medicine couldn't get any stranger, brace yourself because we're talking about urine therapy. Yes, you heard that right. In a world without lab tests or microscopes, doctors turn to pee as their ultimate diagnostic tool, prescription ingredient, and even hygiene product. Picture a physician holding up a flask of golden liquid, squinting at its hue like a fortune teller reading tea leaves, then solemnly declaring whether you'd live or die based on its shade. This wasn't just a fringe practice, it was mainstream medicine backed by textbooks and trusted by kings. Urine was the medieval equivalent of a full body scan. Physicians developed elaborate urine wheels, color-coded charts matching shades to diseases. Straw yellow meant health, but dark brown hinted at liver trouble, and a reddish tint could signal internal bleeding. The smell mattered too. Sweet urine pointed to diabetes, a condition they called the pissing evil, while a foul odor suggested infection, and if visual inspection wasn't enough. Some doctors went further, tasting it to gauge saltiness or bitterness. The logic was simple. Urine was the body's filtered waste, so its contents must reveal inner imbalances. But diagnosis was just the beginning. Urine was also a shockingly versatile treatment. Soldiers soaked bandages in it to clean battle wounds, thanks to its ammonia content, a crude but effective antiseptic. Dentists recommended it as a mouthwash to whiten teeth and toughen gums, though one can only imagine the breath that followed. And for stubborn skin conditions like leprosy or eczema, patients were told to wash in barrels of stale urine, believing its acidity could burn away disease. Even artists got in on the action. Medieval dyers used fermented urine to fix vibrant colors into fabrics, turning a bodily function into an industrial commodity. The most surprising part, some of these uses weren't entirely off base. Ammonia does have cleansing properties, and urine's sterile qualities made it safer than many contaminated water sources. But the line between science and superstition blurred fast. Alchemists prized uroscopy as a way to predict the future, while love potions included drops of a crush's urine to bind their affection. And when the Black Death hit, some desperate souls drank their own pee, convinced it would purge the plague. This practice's legacy is a testament to human ingenuity and desperation. Without modern tools, medieval healers squeezed every possible clue from what they had, even if it meant scrutinizing chamber pots like sacred texts. Today, we might cringe at the thought, but consider this. Astronauts' urine is now recycled into drinking water on the ISS, and pregnancy tests still analyze it for hormones. The methods have sterilized, but the principle remains. Sometimes the answers we need are floating right in front of us. Just maybe don't taste them. In the flickering torchlight of a medieval throne room, a line of desperate souls shuffled forward, their necks swollen with grotesque tumors, a condition known as scrofula, or the king's evil. But these weren't just patients, they were pilgrims seeking a miracle from the most unlikely of healers, their monarch. From England to France, kings and queens held elaborate ceremonies where they laid hands on the sick, believing their divine right to rule came with the power to cure. This wasn't mere pageantry, it was state-sanctioned medicine, where a royal touch could supposedly banish disease as easily as a royal decree could raise taxes. The ritual was as precise as it was theatrical. In England, the monarch would first wash the sufferer's sores with holy water, then trace the sign of the cross over them while murmuring, "The king touches thee, God heals thee." Coins called touch pieces, often stamped with angelic imagery, were hung around the patient's neck as talismans against relapse. French kings went further, incorporating prayers and anointing the afflicted with oil said to have been brought from heaven by a dove. The message was clear. Royalty didn't just govern, they channeled divine power directly into the bodies of their subjects. What's fascinating is how this belief straddled the line between faith and politics. Scrofula, likely a form of tuberculosis affecting the lymph nodes, was notoriously stubborn. When conventional treatments failed, the royal touch offered hope, and kings seized on it to cement their authority. Edward the Confessor was among the first English monarchs credited with the gift, but it was the Plantagenets and Tudors who turned it into a spectacle. Queen Elizabeth I, never one to miss a propaganda opportunity, performed the ritual with particular flair, her hands gloved to avoid direct contact with the diseased. Even the skeptical King William III reluctantly participated, though he reportedly muttered, "May God give you better health and more sense," as he touched each patient. Did it work? Astonishingly, some patients did improve, but not because of divine intervention. The placebo effect, combined with the fact that scrofula sometimes resolves on its own, created enough success stories to keep the tradition alive for centuries. And the ceremonies themselves had unintended benefits. The touch pieces given to the poor often contained silver, which has mild antibacterial properties when pressed against infected skin. The practice's downfall came not from medical advances but from shifting politics. The Enlightenment mocked it as superstition, and the Glorious Revolution's distrust of absolutism made it seem archaic. Yet its legacy lingers in the way we still romanticize the healing power of leaders, whether through presidential blessings or the cult-like faith some place in charismatic figures. The king's evil reminds us that medicine has always been more than science. It's theater, faith, and power, all wrapped in the hope that somewhere, someone holds the magic touch. As the sun dipped below the horizon, medieval families didn't just lock their doors, they sealed every crack and crevice like fortresses under siege. Nightfall didn't just bring darkness, it brought an invisible menace they called miasma, a toxic vapor believed to slither through the air after dusk, carrying everything from fevers to the plague. Windows were shuttered, chimneys plugged, and breathable air traded for stifling warmth, all because the night itself was seen as a carrier of death. This wasn't just caution, it was a medical mandate enforced by physicians who swore that nocturnal breezes carried malignant humors capable of unbalancing the body's fragile equilibrium. The roots of this fear ran deep. Ancient Greek texts like Hippocrates' Airs, Waters, and Places warned that night air was denser and more dangerous, saturated with dampness that could trigger ailments. By the Middle Ages, this idea had morphed into something darker, a belief that demons and maleficent spirits roamed after dark, their presence poisoning the very atmosphere. Travelers told tales of whole villages struck down by night vapors, while midwives whispered that infants left near open windows might succumb to elf breath, a mysterious wasting disease. Even the wealthy weren't immune. Castle bedrooms were designed with thick tapestries and enclosed beds to block out the deadly night air, turning sleep into a claustrophobic ritual. What's startling is how stubbornly this belief clung to life. Centuries later, Florence Nightingale herself railed against it during the Crimean War, insisting hospitals needed ventilation, only to face protests from nurses convinced night air would kill their patients. The irony: sealing homes likely increased disease. Stagnant air trapped bacteria, while poor ventilation turned dwellings into petri dishes for respiratory illnesses. Yet the fear persisted, fueled by genuine observations. Malaria rates did spike near swamps at night, though the culprit was mosquitoes, not miasma, and cooler evening temperatures often coincided with feverish chills. The legacy of this superstition echoes in modern idioms like catching cold, from drafts or warnings to close the window before you sleep. We now know night air isn't toxic, but the medieval mind wasn't entirely wrong to distrust what they couldn't see. Germs, after all, are invisible. Their mistake was blaming the night instead of the microbes riding its breezes. In the end, this belief reveals a timeless truth. Fear thrives in the dark, especially when science hasn't yet turned on the light. When it comes to medieval medicine, few ingredients test modern stomachs like the widespread use of animal dung. Picture a battlefield surgeon packing a soldier's gaping wound with warm horse manure, or a mother spooning a paste of crushed beetles and pigeon droppings into her feverish child's mouth. This wasn't some last-ditch folk remedy, it was textbook treatment, endorsed by physicians from London to Constantinople. Dung wasn't just a desperate measure, it was a prized pharmaceutical, catalogued in meticulous detail for specific ailments. Cow feces treated gout, wolf droppings were swallowed for colic, and goat pellets were brewed into tea to ease jaundice. The logic behind these revolting prescriptions wasn't entirely random. Ancient Egyptians had noted that applying crocodile dung to wounds sometimes prevented infection, likely because the feces contained traces of antibacterial compounds from the animal's diet. Medieval scholars reading these texts centuries later assumed all excrement held similar power. That like cures like principle twisted into grotesque new forms. Since dung was waste, surely it could purge other wastes like tumors or fevers from the body. Some healers took it further, claiming the fresher the droppings, the stronger the cure, leading to markets where the wealthy could purchase still steaming samples for premium prices. But the most surprising twist, a handful of these remedies did have accidental merit. Bird droppings rich in uric acid could sometimes cauterize wounds when no other disinfectants were available. And certain herbivorous animals' dung, packed with partially digested medicinal plants, may have delivered trace amounts of active compounds. A 12th century Arabic text even describes using termite mound clay loaded with antimicrobial microbes from insect feces to treat infected ulcers, a practice modern studies suggest might have genuine scientific backing. The real tragedy lay in the countless cases where dung did nothing but introduce deadly infections. Battlefield wounds packed with manure became breeding grounds for gangrene, and dysentery patients fed fecal teas only worsened their dehydration. Yet the belief persisted, reinforced by the occasional lucky survivor whose immune system fought off infection despite the treatment. By the Renaissance, luminaries like Ambroise Paré began condemning dung remedies as barbaric. But even then, apothecaries still stocked mumia powder made from mummified intestines, their contents considered especially potent. What makes this practice so fascinating isn't just its shock value, but what it reveals about the lengths people will go to when faced with suffering. Without germ theory, medieval healers grabbed whatever tools they had, even if it meant literally playing with fire, or in this case, filth. Today, we might recoil at the thought, but consider this. Modern fecal transplants use carefully screened donor stool to repopulate gut bacteria, proving that even the most maligned medieval remedies sometimes stumble onto something real. The difference: science now knows when to wash its hands. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval physician's study, a patient's fate might hinge less on their symptoms and more on the position of Jupiter. Astrology wasn't just stargazing for entertainment, it was the foundation of medical diagnosis, with doctors convinced that the movements of planets and constellations dictated everything from fevers to fractures. Your zodiac sign didn't just shape your personality, it determined when you'd be bled, which herbs you'd swallow, even the hour a surgeon would dare to pick up his scalpel. This wasn't mystical guesswork. It was a rigid system backed by universities and encoded in textbooks like the Tacuinum Sanatotis, which mapped illnesses to celestial alignments with the precision of a modern MRI scan. The logic was deceptively elegant. Each zodiac sign governed a specific body part. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, and so on down to Pisces and the feet. When the moon passed through a constellation, that corresponding area was considered under attack, making treatments there dangerously risky. A surgeon wouldn't lance a boil on your arm while the moon was in Gemini ruling the arms, just as a physician would avoid bloodletting from the legs during a Pisces transit. Even the timing of herbal remedies followed cosmic rules. Febrifuges for fevers were brewed at dawn under a waning moon, while heart tonics were distilled at midnight during a Venus alignment. But the influence went deeper than scheduling. The four humors blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile were each tied to planetary forces. Mars, the god of war, governed hot, fiery blood, while sluggish phlegm fell under the cold dominion of the moon. A patient's natal chart, cast at birth, could predict lifelong vulnerabilities like a medieval premonition of genetic testing. Kings like Charles V of France employed court astrologers alongside physicians, and universities required medical students to study astronomy before they could touch a lancet. The most fascinating part, this system sometimes worked just not for the reasons they thought. By spacing out treatments, astrology inadvertently prevented over-medicating, giving bodies time to heal naturally. And lunar planting cycles, though based on superstition, did align with moisture levels that affected herb potency. But when the stars got it wrong, the consequences were dire. Plague victims died waiting for auspicious treatment dates, and battlefield wounds festered while surgeons consulted star charts instead of cleaning injuries. Astrology's grip on medicine didn't break easily. Even as the Renaissance dawned, luminaries like Tycho Brahe mixed astronomy with astrology, and Nostradamus first gained fame as a plague doctor using astrological forecasts. Today, we've swapped zodiac charts for lab results, but the impulse remains: how often do we check our horoscopes during stressful times, half joking that Mercury retrograde explains our bad luck? The medieval cosmos might seem laughable now, but its legacy lingers in our unshakable hunger to map the chaos of life onto something grander, even if it's just the silent dance of distant stars. Even something as simple as a sneeze could send medieval minds into a panic. Picture this: you're sitting in a crowded tavern when suddenly, achoo, the room falls silent. Everyone turns to stare, not because you've disrupted the conversation, but because they believe your soul has just momentarily escaped your body. This wasn't just a quirky folk belief, it was a medical and spiritual crisis in miniature. Physicians of the era warned that a sneeze was violent enough to expel the soul through the nose, leaving the body vulnerable to demonic possession or illness. The custom of saying "God bless you" after a sneeze wasn't politeness. It was a protective charm, a verbal shield against unseen dangers. The roots of this fear stretched back to ancient Rome, where sneezing was considered an omen. Pliny the Elder wrote that a violent sneeze could dislodge the brain, while early Christian theologians like Gregory the Great linked sneezing to the plague, interpreting it as a sign of impending death. By the Middle Ages, the stakes had only grown higher. The sudden, uncontrollable force of a sneeze was seen as proof that the body was under siege, either by evil spirits trying to claw their way in or by the soul itself making a desperate bid for freedom. Some healers even prescribed holding one's breath after sneezing to trap the soul back inside, while others recommended pinching the nose shut to prevent further escapes. But the response to sneezing wasn't just about fear. It was a ritual woven into daily life. In some regions, people would immediately grasp a nearby wooden object to ground themselves, believing the soul needed an anchor to return safely. Babies were swaddled tightly after sneezing to prevent their new and fragile souls from drifting away. Even kings weren't exempt. Court physicians recorded royal sneezes as medical events, noting their frequency as signs of divine favor or impending doom. The obsession reached its peak during outbreaks of disease, when a single sneeze could spark panic, sending whole villages into prayers or quarantine. What's remarkable is how this tiny superstition reveals the medieval worldview in microcosm. Every bodily function, no matter how small, was a battleground between the physical and spiritual realms. A cough might be just a cough to us, but to them, it was a potential breach in the fortress of the self. And while we now know sneezing is just the body clearing irritants, the legacy of that fear lingers. We still say, "Bless you," out of habit, a fossilized fragment of an era when the line between a sniffle and the supernatural was razor thin. It's a reminder that even the most ordinary acts were once charged with mystery, and that sometimes the oldest fears leave the faintest, most stubborn echoes. In a world without antibiotics or X-rays, medieval royalty turned to something far more dazzling for their health: gemstones. Rubies weren't just symbols of wealth, they were emergency medicine, pressed against wounds to staunch bleeding. Sapphires, ground into powders and mixed with milk, were dropped into sore eyes to cool inflammation, while emeralds dangled from the necks of epileptics, believed to repel seizures with their verdant glow. This wasn't just wishful thinking, it was a full-blown medical system where the sparkle of a stone could mean the difference between life and death. The logic behind gemstone medicine traced back to ancient ideas about celestial influence. Each precious stone was thought to vibrate with planetary energy. Rubies pulsed with the fiery force of Mars, making them ideal for blood disorders, while sapphires channeled Saturn's clarity, perfect for vision problems. Even the colors held meaning. Emeralds, linked to Venus, supposedly calmed the erratic electrical storms of the brain. Physicians would prescribe specific gems based on a patient's astrological chart, creating bespoke healing kits for the elite. The wealthy wore them as rings, crushed them into tonics, or even slept with them under their pillows to absorb their virtues overnight. But here's the brutal irony: these cures were luxuries most could never afford. A peasant bleeding out from a scythe wound wouldn't get a ruby, they'd get a tourniquet of dirty rags. A farmer's child with seizures might be given a wooden amulet, while nobles clutched emeralds worth a year's harvest. The divide wasn't just economic, it was literally life and death. Records show kings like Henry VIII paid astronomical sums for medicinal diamonds to treat his leg ulcers, while the poor bled out from minor injuries. Did any of it work? In rare cases, the placebo effect might have played a role. A nobleman convinced his ruby ring would stop a nosebleed could relax enough to slow his own bleeding. And some gems, like lapis lazuli, contain trace minerals with actual antibacterial properties when ground into poultices. But mostly, these glittering cures were a stark reminder of medicine's inequity. While the rich hoarded amethysts for sobriety and topazes for insomnia, the masses relied on folk remedies if they had anything at all. The legacy of gemstone medicine isn't just a curiosity, it's a mirror. Even today, wellness trends peddle crystal-infused water or jade facial rollers to those who can afford them, while others lack basic health care. The stones may have changed, but the story remains the same. When desperation meets inequality, healing often glitters, but only for those who can pay the price. Medieval scholars would have been baffled by today's paternity tests, not just by the technology, but by the very idea that mothers contributed anything more than a warm place to grow. The prevailing belief was that men alone provided the seed of life, while women were little more than fertile soil, passively nurturing what their husbands planted. This wasn't just casual sexism, it was scientific dogma rooted in Aristotle's writings and embraced by medieval physicians. They imagined sperm as tiny, fully formed humans' homunculi that simply expanded inside the womb like bread rising in an oven. Women's bodies, in this view, were mere ovens, their only role to keep the heat steady until the baby was done. The consequences of this myth rippled far beyond the birthing chamber. Inheritance laws favored male lineage exclusively, since only fathers were seen as passing on true essence. A child's temperament, intelligence, even physical traits were attributed solely to the father's seed, while mothers bore the blame for any defects thought to arise from a faulty womb or improper care during pregnancy. Royal succession crises erupted when queens produced weak heirs, as if their inadequacy as incubators had diluted the king's perfect homunculus. Even the language of the time reflected this bias. Men fathered children, while women merely bore them, as if performing a biological service rather than sharing in creation. What's fascinating is how fiercely this idea persisted despite glaring contradictions. Farmers knew breeding animals required healthy females, and midwives witnessed maternal traits echoing in newborns. Yet scholars clung to the homunculus theory, twisting observations to fit. When a child resembled its mother, some claimed her womb had imprinted features onto the father's preformed offspring, like a seal pressing into wax. Others argued maternal emotions during pregnancy could warp the homunculus, explaining birthmarks as stains from a mother's sudden fright. The myth's grip only loosened when microscopes revealed sperm and eggs in the 17th century, yet its shadow lingered. For centuries, women had been erased from the story of life itself, their bodies framed as passive vessels rather than equal partners. Today, we understand genetics as an intricate dance of chromosomes from both parents, but the echoes of that medieval belief still whisper in stubborn stereotypes that fathers shape children's futures while mothers merely nurture them. It's a reminder that bad science doesn't just mislead, it shapes societies, leaving scars that take generations to heal. When the first tomatoes arrived in Europe from the Americas, they weren't met with excitement, they sparked terror. Their glossy red skin, so vibrant against the muted tones of medieval cuisine, seemed to whisper of hidden peril. Physicians warned that these strange new fruits could poison the blood, triggering fevers or even madness. The reasoning, a chillingly simple case of guilt by color association. Just as red wine resembled blood, tomatoes were thought to carry a sinister affinity for the body's vital fluids, capable of corrupting them through some unseen sympathetic magic. This wasn't just picky eating, it was a full-blown medical panic that kept tomatoes off European plates for nearly 2 centuries. The fear ran deeper than mere superstition. Medieval medicine operated on a logic of visual cues where resemblance implied connection. Red foods, beets, certain berries, and especially tomatoes, were suspected of overheating the blood, leading to inflammations or rashes. Some texts claimed eating them could cause the blood to boil, resulting in erratic behavior or spontaneous nosebleeds. The tomato's classification as a wolf peach in Germany only fueled suspicions, linking it to mythical creatures and dark magic. Even when Spanish explorers brought tomatoes back in the 16th century, they were initially grown as ornamental curiosities, their fruit considered far too dangerous to consume. What's fascinating is how class and geography shaped this paranoia. In southern Europe, where tomatoes thrived in the climate, peasants eventually began incorporating them into sauces, but only after lengthy boiling, which was believed to neutralize their venomous properties. Meanwhile, British and Northern European aristocrats clung to the danger narrative, dismissing tomatoes as devil's fruit, fit only for peasants or livestock. The shift toward acceptance came not from science but from desperation. During famines, the poor ate tomatoes out of necessity, proving their edibility through sheer survival. The tomato's slow redemption reveals a broader medieval pattern of color-based fear. Red wasn't alone in its infamy. White foods like milk were sometimes avoided for fear they'd induce excess phlegm, while yellow vegetables were thought to cause jaundice. But tomatoes bore the brunt of this chromatic prejudice, becoming a culinary scapegoat for centuries. Today, we laugh at the idea of a spaghetti sauce sparking panic, but the instinct isn't entirely dead. How many modern diet fads still vilify foods based on color: red meat, white sugar, artificial dyes? The tomato's journey from feared to beloved is a reminder that sometimes the boldest flavors face the toughest battles, and that prejudice, even on a plate, takes time to unlearn. If there's one creature that embodies the strange intersection of medieval medicine and modern revival, it's the humble leech. But don't let their slimy, unassuming appearance fool you. These little bloodsuckers weren't just tools for routine bloodletting. They were the Swiss Army knives of medieval treatment, slapped onto everything from swollen gums to infected ears, even delicate eyelids. Physicians believed leeches could rebalance the body's humors by draining excess blood, but their use went far beyond theory. Picture a healer carefully placing a squirming leech onto a patient's eyelid to treat a sty, or packing them into the mouth to purge gum disease. The logic. If blood was the problem, leeches were the living, breathing solution, no matter where the ailment struck. The scale of this obsession was staggering. Apothecaries stocked jars of leeches like candy, and wealthy patients requested them by the dozen. Some treatments called for dozens of leeches at once, latched onto a single limb until the patient turned pale. The French were especially enthusiastic. 19th century records show Parisian hospitals used over 5 million leeches annually, nearly driving the creatures to extinction in Europe. But here's the twist: medieval practitioners weren't entirely wrong about their utility. Leeches secrete Urine, a natural anticoagulant that keeps blood flowing smoothly, and modern medicine still uses them in microsurgery to reduce clotting. The problem wasn't the leeches themselves, it was the sheer scale of their misuse, fueled by a blind devotion to ancient texts rather than observable results. What's most revealing is how leeches became a symbol of medical stagnation. Even as autopsies revealed the circulatory system's true workings, physicians kept applying leeches to treat ailments they clearly didn't understand, like tuberculosis or mental illness. The leech's persistence wasn't just about ignorance, it was about authority. Galen's ancient writings had endorsed them, and challenging that dogma meant risking professional ruin. So the leeches clung on, much like the patients they drained, long after better options existed. Today, we've reclaimed leeches for niche surgical uses, but their medieval saga is a cautionary tale. It's not just about blood or superstition, it's about how easily tradition can become tyranny, and how hard it is to pry old ideas from the grip of those who profit from them. The next time you see a leech in a medical documentary, remember, their story isn't just history, it's a mirror. In the dimly lit halls of medieval monasteries, the line between doctor and priest blurred into near invisibility. When fever ravaged a village or plague swept through a town, the first response wasn't to mix herbs or draw blood, it was to kneel. Prayer wasn't just a comfort, it was frontline medicine, prescribed with the same urgency as any potion or poultice. Monks meticulously recorded which saints to invoke for specific ailments: Saint Roch for the plague, Saint Blaise for throat infections, Saint Apollonia for toothaches, turning heaven into a kind of celestial pharmacy where divine intervention was the ultimate cure. This wasn't blind faith, it was a system as structured as any medical textbook. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed by monasteries across Europe, laid out exact protocols for treating sick brothers, prayers at specific hours, fasting to purify the soul, and penance to atone for the sins believed to cause illness. A chronic fever wasn't just a malfunction of the body, it was a sign of moral corruption, a physical manifestation of spiritual imbalance. Treatment involved confession as much as convalescence, with monks spending hours reciting psalms over the afflicted, their words thought to carry tangible healing power. The scale of this practice was staggering. Monasteries doubled as hospitals, their infirmaries filled with patients who'd traveled days for a chance to be prayed over. Some even offered sleep therapy, where the sick would rest near relics or in chapels, hoping dreams would bring divine diagnosis. The Miracles of St. Thomas Becket recounts a woman blind for years regaining her sight after bathing her eyes in water mixed with the martyr's blood, a typical example of how spiritual and physical remedies intertwined. But here's the paradox: sometimes it worked, not because angels intervened, but because the rituals created conditions for recovery. Fasting, while framed as penance, could ease digestive issues. The quiet of a monastery provided rest impossible in noisy, crowded villages, and the placebo effect was potent. Believing in a cure could rally the body's defenses, especially when paired with genuine care. Monastic infirmaries were also pioneers of hygiene, with monks washing patients and airing linens long before secular hospitals adopted such practices. The darker side of this belief, though, was the blame it placed on sufferers. If prayer failed, the fault lay with the patient's insufficient faith or unconfessed sins. Parents mourning a child's death were told it was God's will, a punishment for hidden wickedness. This theology of sickness as divine retribution left little room for scientific inquiry. Why seek earthly causes when heaven's judgment was explanation enough? Yet the legacy of monastic medicine isn't just a relic of superstition. Modern studies confirm that prayer and meditation can lower stress hormones, and hospitals still integrate chaplains into care teams. The medieval monks grasped something we're only now quantifying. Healing isn't just about the body, but the mind and spirit tangled within it. Their mistake wasn't valuing faith, it was rejecting the world where faith and science might have walked hand in hand. In the hushed chambers of a medieval manor, a pregnant woman startles at the sudden appearance of a hare, and in that moment, her worst fear takes root. According to the era's medical texts, her fright could literally imprint itself onto her unborn child, leaving the baby with a hare lip or worse. This was the terrifying doctrine of maternal impressions, a belief that a mother's emotions or experiences during pregnancy could physically deform her child. A moment of anger might birth a hot-tempered infant. Glimpsing a disfigured beggar could result in a malformed limb, and even cravings for certain foods, if denied, were thought to leave visible marks on the baby's skin. This wasn't just folklore, it was a medical consensus that turned pregnancy into a minefield of guilt and superstition. The roots of this belief stretch back to antiquity. Aristotle claimed that a mother's imagination acted like a seal pressing into wax, shaping the malleable fetus. By the Middle Ages, this idea had hardened into dogma, with physicians cataloging alleged cases. A woman who touched her face during a shock bore a child with a facial birthmark. Another who admired a portrait too intensely delivered a baby resembling the painting's subject. The logic was seductive in its simplicity. Strong emotions caused imbalance in the womb, and that imbalance manifested as physical traits, but the consequences were anything but simple. Mothers grieving stillbirths or children with disabilities faced not just heartbreak but public blame. Their grief, their fear, even their fleeting thoughts were scrutinized for clues to the cause of their child's condition. What's especially cruel is how this belief weaponized maternal love itself. Women went to absurd lengths to avoid risks, avoiding ugly sights, suppressing natural emotions, even wearing blindfolds during eclipses lest the celestial event stain their unborn child. Some aristocratic women hired beauty watchers to ensure they were surrounded only by harmonious scenes, while peasant mothers agonized over every nightmare or moment of frustration. The psychological toll was immense. Manuscripts from the period reveal confessional prayers from pregnant women begging forgiveness for allowing a fright or sinful thought that might have harmed their baby. The tragedy, of course, is that maternal impressions have no basis in biology. Birth defects and genetic conditions arise from chromosomal anomalies or developmental factors, not a mother's momentary fear. Yet the myth persisted well into the 19th century, with doctors still blaming hysterical women for their children's epilepsy or clubfoot. Even today, echoes linger in the way society polices pregnant women's behavior, judging their diets, stress levels, or choices as if fetal health hinges solely on maternal perfection. The medieval fear of maternal impressions wasn't just bad science. It was a distortion of nature's randomness into a narrative of fault, leaving generations of mothers shouldering burdens that were never theirs to bear. The real lesson here isn't about medieval ignorance, it's about how easily fear twists into blame. When faced with the unexplainable, humanity has a habit of pointing fingers rather than admitting uncertainty. And in that dark space between mystery and judgment, it's always the most vulnerable who pay the price. Of all the medieval misconceptions about the human body, few proved as stubborn or as dangerous as the belief in spontaneous generation. Picture a butcher's stall in the Middle Ages, flies buzzing around a slab of meat left too long in the sun. As maggots writhe across its surface, the shopkeeper nods knowingly, clearly. The rotting flesh itself has birthed these wriggling creatures. This wasn't just a casual assumption. It was a scientific principle endorsed by giants like Aristotle, who wrote that life could arise from non-living matter as effortlessly as dew forming on morning grass. Mice supposedly emerged from piles of dirty hay, beetles from the mud of riverbanks, and eels from the ooze of lake beds. The world, to medieval eyes, was a ceaseless font of spontaneous creation, where life bubbled up from the inanimate without need for parents or eggs. The consequences of this belief rippled far beyond curious kitchen observations. Without understanding reproduction or microorganisms, medieval healers misdiagnosed the true causes of disease. When plague victims' bodies swarmed with fleas, physicians blamed the corpses themselves for generating the pests, rather than recognizing the insects as carriers. Surgical instruments were stored in dusty cupboards, their eventual contamination seen as inevitable. After all, if mold could sprout from nowhere on bread, why not infection on a scalpel? This mindset created a vicious cycle: filth bred spontaneous life, which bred more filth, reinforcing the idea that cleanliness was futile against nature's relentless creativity. Even the brightest minds of the era twisted logic to fit the theory. The 14th century scholar Albertus Magnus claimed to have witnessed geese hatched from barnacles growing on driftwood, while others swore scorpions emerged from crushed basil left in sunlight. These weren't tall tales, they were carefully documented proofs of a world where life required no lineage. The Church even weighed in, citing spontaneous generation as evidence of God's ongoing miracles until the idea collided with theology. Medieval rabbis debated whether spontaneously generated creatures needed kosher slaughter, while Christian scholars puzzled over whether such beings had souls. The myth's unraveling began not with a dramatic discovery, but with quiet observations. In the 17th century, a Tuscan physician named Francesco ready placed meat in jars, some sealed, some open. When maggots appeared only on the exposed meat, it hinted at a truth as unsettling as it was obvious. Life comes from life, yet even then the old beliefs clung like cobwebs. Microscopes eventually revealed microbes, but some scientists still argued these tiny beings must arise spontaneously, until Louis Pasteur's swan-necked flasks proved once and for all that no life emerges without ancestors. What makes this belief so haunting isn't just its wrongness, but its resilience. For millennia, it shaped how humans interacted with decay, disease, and even their own bodies. When a wound festered, it wasn't unseen germs at work. It was the flesh itself, generating corruption. Today, we know better, but the ghost of spontaneous generation lingers in our language. How often do we say mold appears or bacteria grow without considering their origins? The medieval world saw life as a magic trick materializing from nothing. We now know it's a chain stretching back to the dawn of time, but breaking that illusion took centuries of painstaking science, one observation at a time.